Do you guys happen to have that one item in your house that, while functionally it belongs out in the open on a table on the kitchen bench, but aesthetically it just drives you nuts being there? For me, that one item is the red wine box. Now, usually we just keep it in the fridge because personally I prefer my wine to be chilled, but the fridge is getting a bit full and it's been kind of inconvenient having to shove this massive box in there on a shelf that really doesn't fit there. So lately it's just been sitting on the kitchen counter, looking kinda ugly. Hi guys, my name is Vix and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, we do a whole bunch of things. From DIY to hobbies to pets and life in general. Hopefully there's something here you'll enjoy. So the other day I started researching online and being like, okay, surely someone's come up with a nice covering for this item. So that I don't have to see it. I can see something like some nice wood paneling or something instead. And I tell you what, there are some gorgeous designs out there. But I stumbled upon this particular one and I thought, oh my god, this is perfect. It's beautiful. I love it. And then I looked at the price. And at the time, I didn't even realize it was in US dollars, not Australian dollars. So it's even worse. But then I looked closer and I thought, hang on, maybe I can DIY this. And then I looked even closer and I think they might have used plywood and I just happen to have a bunch of scrap plywood in the garage. Now, no shame to this product. This is going to be 10 times better than anything I can pull off with the scrap wood in my garage. So if you guys want to check it out, the link is in the description. But I'm a little bit of a cheapskate and I want to save some money. So I'm going to try and build it with just the materials that are sitting in my workshop right now. And I tell you what, I'm not really spoilt for choice with the wood at the moment. I actually thought I took some photos or some videos of the wood I was using and I can't find them. So you'll see snippets of it throughout the footage, but yeah, it's literally just like 2 planks of plywood. But I think we can make this work. And at the very least, it's gonna clear out some of the scrap wood. So it's a win-win. Hi guys, quick side note from Editor Vix. The birds have been chattering through the entire voiceover that I've been doing. They're just gonna stay there. Blame Ollie the budgie, he's been the loudest, but Nim's been pretty bad too. Sorry! So the first thing I like to do is map out any key dimensions that I'm going to need to build this particular project. Here I'm drawing out the wine box so that I can mark down the length, width, and depth. This will inform the design. I'm also marking out where the spout is and the dimensions of the spout so I can work out what tools to use to cut this out later. Next up, I'm just marking a quick note about the thickness of the plywood because this is going to affect the measurements of the box itself. Essentially for some of the sides, we're going to have to add this thickness to them to actually get the right dimension. So now I'm drawing out the design. We're going to be using the thicker plywood for the sides, bottom and back. We know the height of the box is 22.5 centimeters, but we need to add the plywood thickness because the base is actually going to fit flush with this side. I'm going to calculate these at the end because my brain does not work under pressure and basic math becomes something completely foreign to me. Here I'm just marking out the base and the other side. We know the width of the box is 12 centimeters and we don't need to add the plywood thickness, but we are going to add like a slight tolerance just so we know the box is going to fit even if my tools or my measurements, my cuts are not that accurate. We also want the tolerance just so we can actually slide the box in and out easily. I don't want it to get stuck in there. The back is a similar thing, it's going to be 12 centimeters plus a tolerance, and the depth of the box here is going to be 19 centimeters plus 2 lots of the plywood thicknesses. Now I actually make a mistake here. I add an extra centimeter for the allowance of the door, but I actually don't need the second plywood thickness because this is going to be a thin sheet at the front. So I end up taking off that additional 1 centimeter and just using the 1.2 thickness of the plywood allowance at the front as the allowance for the front door. Calculating these all together as you can see here, and I just add a little plus ... for allowance of a tolerance. Usually for the tolerance I'll round it up by about 0.5 of a centimeter in this case. Some of them I make it a bit smaller, it just depends on how much of a tolerance I think I'm going to need for these pieces. I'm not too worried about the dimensions of the front door at this stage because I'm going to do it as we go. And I'm not really sure what I'm going to do for the roof or the legs at this stage. So I'm just sort of leaving them blank and that's the design for now. But sadly, the plywood that I have at my disposal is not really big enough for these dimensions. So my next step is to measure them up and see what I actually have to work with. Here I worked out the first piece is 15 centimeters and the other is 11 centimeters wide. The grains on these do not match, which is a bit of a pain. I also measured the length and found that the first wood was 89.5 centimeters long and the second was 112 centimeters long. Without doing the math, I had a feeling this was going to work, but it was going to be kind of tight, at least for the larger board that I wanted to use for most of the pieces. This is also where I realized my mistake, that I had added an extra centimeter to the end when I already added the plywood thickness, which would be enough for the front. So given that I'm a very visual person, I decided the best course of action, instead of trying to work out the calculations, was to just measure up the pieces that I needed and see if I actually had enough wood to do the job. At this point, I wasn't really putting in an allowance for the saw blade that I was going to use, but I just figured I'd add an extra maybe half centimeter to a centimeter at the end, and if I had that, I knew I probably had enough to cut all the pieces and still have the allowance for the sword blade. Considering the width of this wood is 15 centimeters and we needed about 12 centimeters plus something for a couple of the pieces, I decided to firstly measure out the bottom piece and the back piece. I wanted to try and minimize how many pieces were going to actually be multiple pieces of wood glued together, just to make sure that the structure was going to be strong enough to hold a full one of these. And thumbs up, it fits. We got the measurement right. And here we're just marking out the back piece. Same again as the bottom. I'm also marking these little diagonal lines on the places that I'm not going to keep the wood, so I know which is actually the good side. Particularly since this wood is already marked with so many other lines from another project. Now this is where I realized for the side pieces it was going to be a little tricky. I knew the wood wasn't wide enough or long enough to do a single side piece, and I was going to have to use the wood on the right to compensate for the missing length. But I was starting to realize that the length of the first wood was a little short, and I had to work out what was the best way to cut it so that I could maximize its use for these side pieces. I ended up stealing a little bit of length from the back piece because I realized I added too much extra plywood thickness on the sides, and that was enough to just scrape by. And with that done, we can get to cutting out all these pieces. Safety first, we do not want to end up with damaged hearing or eyes, and we're also going to be doing this outside because there's going to be a lot of dust. I'll tell you what, I picked probably the worst day to do this project. It was 38 degrees Celsius during this entire thing, and it was 39 degrees the next day too, so I couldn't escape it. So here I am in the sweltering heat, doing what I love, cutting things to shreds. I tell you what, this is probably my favorite tool in the garage, but I really wish we had a table saw or something. I don't know, maybe I'll add that to the list for a future garage upgrade. Because, like, it's great, but I don't know, I feel like it could be more efficient. Or maybe one of those table saws that you can, like, press down to cut wood at weird angles and stuff too. Oh, one day. Probably need a bigger garage for that. But for now, this works fine. It was a bit of a pain to set up these clamps in a way that the actual saw wasn't going to hit them, and I definitely had to redo some of these cuts a couple of times because parts of the metal plate would hit it. Eventually I got all the starting parts cut out that we marked out on that piece of plank, and I could consult my little drawing and work out how I was going to extend the side pieces using that second plank where the grain didn't match up. I didn't bother measuring this one out. I decided to use the existing wood to cut them to the right size. Turns out I actually cut the first pieces of the side pieces a little bit too short. They didn't quite have the width I needed. On this one, I cut them to the right width, so there was actually this bit of a gap between the two parts. We're going to clean that up later though. So now we can put all these pieces together and see if I actually get it right. And here you can see I'm like, oh no, they're not matching up. But it's okay. I knew these weren't going to look the best, mainly because the grain didn't match up and there were two separate pieces to form the side pieces. But luckily we had a bunch of plywood sheets that were really, really thin. And I was going to use them to sort of make like a veneer covering for the side pieces. So all you would see was that nice one piece outside of the side pieces and not the weird mismatched thicker plywood that I've used to actually make the structure for them. So this is our not so secret stash of plywood. This is the sheet I opted to use. And you can tell it's really well organized in here. There were some bigger sheets, but I wanted to, stick to using the scrap pieces, try to be as economical with the plywood as I could. So here I'm just marking out the dimensions of the side piece, which is the two mix match pieces joined together. And we're going to go a bit wider than this. My thoughts were I was going to cut this out, glue it to the thicker plywood, and then I was going to go with the saw while it's all glued together to try and get a nice, even, consistent edge, rather than having to try and sand 3 different pieces of wood that are glued together. Now, annoyingly, the piece of plywood I happened to cut had one of these stickers on it that Bunnings puts on them. And sometimes these come off really easily, and other times I just can't get them off. So I spent a good, 30 seconds to a minute before I gave up, and later I realized it was gonna get covered up by the thicker pieces anyway because I was gonna glue that side. So, oh well, bit of a waste of time, but that's okay. And here's the other veneer piece here. Everything looks good, the thicker pieces fit on it, thumbs up, we're good to go. So now we're going to look at gluing on the veneer piece to the thicker plywood pieces. We're just going to be using a woodworking glue for this one. This has been my staple glue for quite a while now. Although it was so hot that the glue was just a little bit thickened. It was a little bit of a struggle to get it out. I wasn't sure if it was going to work, but it was fine. It was a bit lumpy, but it did the job. I hope I had to reapply it a couple of times when some of the pieces came apart a little bit, but it did alright. I definitely need to look at investing in some more clamps though. Definitely did not have enough clamps for this job. Probably should have put a big piece of plywood or some sort of wood on top and clamped it like a book clamp sort of situation. But I was being a little bit lazy, so I just used some Ryobi batteries and anything else I could find that was heavy in the garage, with the 3 quick release clamps and the 2 older clamps that I had at my disposal. It did alright. I had to do some cleanup, as I said before, like some of the parts came apart and I had to put some more glue in and clamp them up. But the end result actually turned out alright. So I need to wait a little bit for this glue to dry based on a label, maybe about an hour, but 24 hours until it fully sets. So I decided to start working on the bottom and the back pieces and just attaching them together. The nails that I had were a little bit too long. I would have preferred some shorter ones. I did have some shorter nails that are used for picture hooks, but I decided to opt for the larger bullet head ones. I've split a lot of plywood with nails and screws in my day, so I decided to take this as carefully as possible. I started by getting the nails through one piece of wood, adding the glue, and then aligning the pieces and hammering the nails through all the way. I ended up hammering them all the way on the portable sawhorses outside, but all of my care did not save me and the nails went through the wood. I tried to fix it, hammer it back in, and it made it worse. So I ended up just removing the nails, starting again. I decided to use the wood glue to try and patch up the wood as best as I can, but at least I didn't make a mistake on the front. Once it was patched up as well as I could and dried a little bit, I decided to try putting the nails back in, and to my surprise, the first one went in really easy, and I was really confused. And then I realized why it went in so easy. It split the wood again. But that's okay because we're going to add some glue in there, clamp it up, and hopefully it'll be fine. So now we just have to wait for the glue to dry and then we can start cleaning up the side pieces. I ended up adding some more clamps and some more heavier objects, but yeah, I had to go in later and fix it up a bit. Once I was fairly satisfied that the glue had dried enough, I removed the clamps, assembled it, and tried to work out, alright, how much can I actually cut off? How much excess is there? And you can see where the wood pieces don't line up there, so I definitely want to remove that and make it as flush as possible. And I realized there was actually quite a decent amount of wood that I could cut off, even from the bottom piece. So we're going to cut off all of this in one fell swoop and save us some elbow grease and sanding later. On this particular piece, there was one side that I didn't think needed to be cut, but all the rest I cut them nice and flush and got a nice clean edge. As clean as I could get anyway. So once it was all cut down to size, I assembled the box again and marked out how much excess I had on the bottom piece so that I could just cut off and make everything nice and flush. I definitely like to assemble the project after every cut, just as a sanity check to make sure I've got it all right before I start gluing or nailing or moving on to the next step. Because the next step was a tricky one and I wasn't 100% sure how I was going to do it yet. I wanted to cut a channel into the side pieces so that I could slide a thin piece of plywood down as the front. This would slide over the spout and make everything nice and covered, but also make it easy for the wine box to be put into this. I decided to put together a pretty crude jig that was just going to lift up the blade a bit higher so that it wouldn't be able to cut through the wood completely. I messed around with this a bit with different pieces of scrap wood and eventually got the right height I needed. This was an extremely crude setup, and I think if I had to do this again, I'd actually build a proper jig rather than just placing a bunch of scrap wood together and clamping it down, because even with the clamps it was a bit unstable and the cut wasn't consistent. But a thumbs up regardless, because it worked. However, you will see here that one side is actually a lot deeper than the other, so I decided to put the deeper side at the top, just to make it a little bit easier to initially slide the front slide in. Now, I actually made a mistake with this next step, and see if you can spot it. I missed something that I've been hampering on for quite a while now, but in any case, I glued the sides and nailed them together, just as I had done with the back and the bottom piece. This went in a lot smoother and a lot better than those pieces though. And moving on to the other side, this was actually slightly easier than the first side. I guess it was just a bit more stable and put together and wasn't moving as much. I'm also making sure that everything lines up before putting in the next set of nails. And thumbs up, it's looking good. So I'm going to work out the dimensions of the front piece by measuring the gaps here, these little channels that we put in before. Just marking this out on the thin plywood, and then we're going to cut it out. I actually made a mistake with these measurements. I didn't make the door tall enough. I'm not sure how that happened. I must have just taken the wrong measurement off the ruler, but it ended up working in my favor fine, so it's not an issue. However, that mistake was not the thing I was talking about earlier on. You're about to see that in just a second. I forgot to check whether the channels were wide enough to fit the thickness of this thin plywood. I just assumed that they would be, but as you can see here, they were not. And I didn't do a fit test. I should have done a fit test. But now everything was glued and nailed together. I tried pulling it apart. It wasn't going to come apart nicely. I was going to end up splitting the wood. So I ended up just going through the garage and finding whatever tool I could to see what would work. I started with a Dremel with a little sanding bit. That was going okay, but kind of poorly because it was kind of turning into a burner. It was getting so hot. I ended up going with this multi-tool. This worked pretty well. I'm usually scared of this thing, but today it was a bit nicer. I guess I'm used to trying to cut things that are a lot harder than this plywood. So this ended up working really well. It was small enough to fit into the box and it didn't mess up the wood too badly. Took me a good half an hour to an hour to fix this. I really wish I had checked before I assembled the box. It's still a bit tight. It doesn't move very smoothly, but it's good enough for me, so that's fine. Now here, you can see where I've realized the mistake. It's not tall enough. I don't know how I got this measurement wrong. I have no idea. But lucky for me, it's the perfect position for the cut that I was gonna have to make in order to split the front panel into two separate pieces so that it could slide over the spout. So it was a bit of a blessing in disguise. Now, you know how I mentioned this was a really hot day? It was 38 degrees. My phone got so hot that it had a bit of an aneurysm and I lost a little bit of footage of just cutting out and measuring this piece. But it's the same as before. We're just going to bang it into place there. I'm not really worried about this one being able to slide because it's basically going to stay there. I could have glued it in, but it was wedged in enough. Now I'm just sliding the top part of the front panel in. And I got a bit confused because it seemed like it was too thin. It wasn't sitting in the channels properly, so I thought, oh, maybe the plywood has moved apart and I need to bang it back in. And then I realized I was using the wrong piece of wood. I had recently cut out the top of this box and it just so happened to look pretty much exactly the same, except the wood grain didn't match up and it's just slightly thinner. And I got lucky with the way that I was cutting up that thin sheet of plywood today because the two pieces for the front matched up perfectly. Like the grain was just, oh, I loved it. It does get a bit covered up later, but oh, so good. Definitely getting very comfortable with that tool now. I used it just to take off a little bit of extra that was on the top piece of the box. And then I got to working out the dimensions of the spout. I originally wrote down in the design that it was 4 centimeters, but that was like the outside. It actually gets a bit thinner closer to the box, and that's what we want the front panel to wrap around. So that one was actually 3.5 centimeters. Now, I had no idea how I was going to cut this circle out. I started with the bit that you can see here, and it was 25 millimeters, so it wasn't big enough. And it kept getting caught because of the panels. It did manage to cut out one side pretty well, but it was making a mess, and at the very least it gave me a bit of a starting template. Funnily enough, I actually had one of those bits that's made for cutting circles out, but it was too big. It was the opposite. So I ended up taking out the front panel and using the multi-tool to cut like little lines into it that I could just snap off or break off with the multi-tool itself to get the circle, and this worked really, really well. And doing a quick check here to make sure it's all nice and circular and lined up. Don't forget your fit checks. I know I forgot one of them, but gotta keep doing it. I also checked with the wine box in and found it was a bit small, so I just marked out another circle and cut that out further. But of course it was a bit rough around the edges, and considering I hadn't really used the Dremel a lot in recent history since this project, I thought, you know what? Maybe I can use one of the sanding bits and get a really smooth finish, save me having to hand sand and basically use my finger to do it because it was such a small hole. And I was amazed with how well it worked, and I'm gonna have to use this all the time now. I even found for the top panel I was better off just using the Dremel with the sanding bit instead of trying to cut it out more. Like, it worked that well. So now we have all the pieces, let's do a quick test. See if it all fits together. I did find I have to pull out the nozzle a little bit just to get it in the right position. And of course the front panel is a little bit rigid. It's a bit hard to get it in there, but wow, it worked really well. I was getting excited now. So I gave everything a really quick sand because I'm not a big fan of sanding. Just to smooth it up a bit. It's hard to get plywood to look nice, but I think it looked alright. Then I decided to use some wood filler. I found this, it was the right color, but it was solid. So that's going in the bin, but luckily I had another container. This one wasn't quite the right color. It was way too dark or way too red. But I was planning on staining this anyway, so I figured, it's probably going to be fine. No one's gonna notice. Just applying that with my finger there, getting into all the crevices, any holes. I know it's not going to be perfect, but I can at least clean it up a little bit. I'm also reattaching these top edges. As I mentioned way earlier in this video, the plywood veneer was pulling apart at some points, so I just put in some glue, clamped it up in the places that needed a bit more love, and that worked pretty well. No problems here. And I'm just going to wipe up some of this excess glue. I'm going to sand it back anyway, but any bubbles like this can take a long time to cure, and it's going to make a mess of any stain I try to use. Now, annoyingly, the only stain I had was this black stain, and I don't get me wrong, I love this stain. I use it all the time for the furniture in my house. I think it looks beautiful, but I wasn't sure if I wanted this product to be black. So I started off by just staining the inside to see if I liked it. But I really wanted the wood tones to contrast with some black legs or something, and this wasn't working for me. You can see in a second I start to get really hesitant with the brush as I'm about to do the outside, and I ended up thinking, you know what? Nah, screw it, we're gonna try something else. I may not have any stain, but I definitely have some paint, and there is one shade in particular that I was just pulling out everything out of the cupboards to try and find it. I've had this paint for way too long, probably about 10 years now. I'm surprised it's still alive. It's just acrylic paint. But it's in the color Burnt Umber, and I use this a lot because you can kind of fake a stain if you do it as a wash. So what I'm going to be doing is putting the paint on this well-used and well-loved platter here and putting heaps of water in it. Get it really, really runny. so you can still see the grain when you put it on. You might need a couple of coats. You have to be careful about what sort of paint you're using. I found this acrylic was fine, but sometimes you can get some weird clumps and stuff if it's too old. I was really surprised that didn't happen here. I also built it up a little bit more with more paint when there was some glue on the outside that just wasn't getting covered up. I find the glue I use is definitely hydrophobic, and it just will not soak up any sort of stain or paint that's water-based if it's on the surface. So build up the paint a bit more in those areas. Definitely wouldn't recommend using paint if you can use stain, but again, I wanted to make this using the things that I had in my garage at the time. Now, looking back, I kind of wish I had a bit of a sienna paint as well, get a bit more yellows in there, because when I brought it out into the kitchen later, I found that it didn't quite have the same sort of tone as the other furniture pieces, but it's alright because it's close enough, and we're going to put some oil on top later on that's going to tone it a bit more better in the right direction. Now, moving on to the legs, I did consider trying to carve some wood for this. I was really enjoying the Dremel and the multi-tool if you couldn't tell, but I decided to 3D print them instead. I also considered designing them myself, but it was really hot and I was over it by this point. So I found these monitor stand supports by Timinator on Fangs that I really enjoyed the design of, and I also printed off some hinges so that I could attach the top to the back. These hinges were actually a bit too thick, as you'll see later on, so I found some other ones, but I thought I'd give you the details just in case you're interested in them. I don't know about you guys, but I really enjoy just watching 3D printers. I don't know, I find it really satisfying. So here's some footage of mine printing out this one. I printed this out on Neptune, which is the Neptune 4 Plus, my new edition. And oh my god, it's so satisfying. So I decided to move on to another task while that was printing out. One of the things I noticed about the product was that they had a little blackboard area so that you could mark out what type of wine was currently in the case. Now, I actually happen to have these stickers, which we use on some of our containers to mark with flour and baking soda, and it worked really well, and I kind of wonder if that's what they used. Not sure where we originally got these, probably Amazon, but these are excellent. You can also buy blackboard paint as well if you do want to do something similar without buying the stickers. So eventually the prints were ready. I actually didn't dial in the filament before making this print, so it was a little bit stringy on the supports, but it's fine. No one's gonna notice. I mean, you guys will, but no one in real life will notice, right? So now I got to the exciting part and I could actually assemble this. When I sliced these supports to print, I actually made them a bit bigger so that they would sit flush with the box. But in doing so, I made the little holes that were made for screws too big too. So I considered screwing bigger screws in, but I thought I'll probably end up just splitting the plywood. So I opted for the woodworking glue. Looking back, I'd probably use super glue instead, but these actually worked. We'll see how it holds up over time though. So remember how I mentioned that the original hinge I printed was just too big? I ended up going with this one on Colts 3D. Nice and simple, nice and flat, and it worked really well. And lucky for me, the print only took 5 minutes, so no need to wait around for it to happen. I thought I'd try filming a little time lapse for this one, but the piece was so small that you can't even see it. Oh well, I tried. So with that printed, we can begin attaching it to the box. So I wanted this hinge so that the top piece can, lift up, make it easier to put the wine box in here. We're going to be using super glue for this one, what I should have probably used for the support legs, but it's okay, we learn. So the other thing I noticed was that the wood finish was looking pretty bad. It was looking really dry and the paint just wasn't doing a good job of finishing it off. So I opted for some timber oil. I considered doing a varnish, but then I was like, well, if I've definitely got the color wrong, I won't be able to fix it later. Whereas with the oil, once it dries out, I could try touching up the color in like a couple of months. So hopefully I don't have to do that, but I kind of prefer using the oil anyway. Saves me having to commit to something and make a mistake. So I think we might be just about ready for a final reveal. Well guys, I hope you enjoyed the video. I really enjoyed making this. A quick side note though, the hinge snapped on me. It's not a big issue for me. But considering the size, maybe consider buying a metal hinge from your hardware store instead. I wish I had a metal hinge in my garage that I could use for this project, but well. Another thing is I probably won't use the blackboard, but it looks really aesthetically pleasing, so it's gonna stay there. But overall, I really enjoyed this. This was a fantastic video to get back into YouTube and get back into woodworking as well. If you guys enjoyed the video, don't forget to hit the thumbs up button. And if you like what I do here and want to see more, feel free to subscribe and hit the notification bell. I hope you have a wonderful day or night wherever you may be, and I will see you guys in the next video. Bye!